Hey everybody, this is video 2 of chapter 4 of Matthias Küntzel's Nazis, Islamic Antisemitism in the Middle East, the 1948 Arab War against Israel, and the Aftershocks of World War II. And again, chapter 4 is titled 1948 Arab-Israeli War. And the sections are the Muslim Brotherhood and the Mufti, the First Middle East War, Qualms of the Arab League, Anti-Semitic Mobilization, Aftershocks of National Socialism, Israel's Guilt, ? And we're starting from, in this video, the First Middle East War. On the 29th of November 1947, over two-thirds of the UN member states voted in favor of a two-state solution for Palestine. 56% of the mandate territory was to become a Jewish state containing 500,000 Jews and 500,000 Arabs. 43% would form an Arab state comprising 750,000 Arabs and 10,000 Jews. Jerusalem was to be placed under international control. A moment. Let me get to this footnote. Okay, the footnote is resolution 181. I guess part 2, or the second one. Future government of Palestine. And footnote. Jews danced the night away in the streets for joy. The next day, 6 were murdered. The Arab War to prevent the implementation of the decision had begun. Footnote. See Yakov Lazovic, Israel's Existenzkampf. And that's being a dick. Trying to look some goddamn shit up. Alright, here we are. Anyway, I'm just gonna move on. I'll look for it later. This book apparently translates as Right to Exist, a Moral Defense of Israel's Wars. There's a Wikipedia for it. It says, Right to Exist, a Moral Defense of Israel's Wars is a book by German-born Israeli historian Yakov Lazovic, the director of Archives of the Holocaust Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Authority. In the book, Lazovic draws on just war theory, particularly on Michael Walzer's work, Just and Unjust Wars, in an attempt to evaluate Israel's wars in the light of moral philosophy. Ethan Berner in the New York Times found the book a largely persuasive defense of Israel's position morally and politically, but disputed the statement that there is no, quote, cycle of violence, unquote, and that there is only one-sided aggression against Israel, simply fighting back, against, quote, Palestinian terrorists, end quote. Ethan Broner felt this ignored the daily aggression that the 36-year occupation entails, the roadblocks, the searches, the confiscated land. According to Chad Allen Goldberg, writing in Contemporary Sociology, Lozovic develops the following thesis. Quote, what I found in my review of Israel's wars was that Zionism has mostly tried to be moral. Sometimes it made mistakes from which it generally, but not always, learned. While being continuously at war, it was surprisingly successful at all sorts of other projects, such as the building of a reasonably healthy society out of diverse communities, end quote. According to Chad Allen Goldberg, Lozovic concludes that all of Israel's wars except the 1982 invasion of Lebanon have met with the jus ad bellum. Goldberg writes that, quote, one of Lozovic's most important contributions is to refute the pernicious claim that Zionism is a form of European colonialism, end quote. And that another important contribution is the refutation of the charge that Israel is a racist state. According to David Hersani, Lozovic argues that, quote, Israelis have generally learned from their blunders, constantly reappraised their policies and their place in the world. Despite this self-criticism, Zionism is frequently rejected by classification, regardless of its tangible policies, actions, or attempts at peace, end quote. David Mandel writes that Lozovic, quote, concludes that, quote, the will to murder Jews was never the result of oppression and can never be resolved by removing oppression, end quote. Summarizing his view that the conflict between Arab and Jew is not the product of grievances that Israeli policy can assuage. Okay. Sorry about that. Where the hell am I? End footnote. The fighting lasted for well over a year. Initially, it was a civil war conducted on the Arab side by two irregular guerrilla bands. The second and decisive interstate phase began in May 1948. On the 14th of May 1948, Ben Gurion proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel. A few hours later, Arab armies invaded the infant country. From the north came 6,000 Syrian, 2,000 Lebanese, and 4,500 Iraqi troops. From the east, 6,500 Jordanian forces, and from the south, 5,500 Egyptian soldiers. Since the British mandate had ended on the 15th of May, there was no one to stop the Arab armies entering the country. In October 1947, a few weeks before the UN partition resolution, the General Secretary of the Arab League, Abd al-Rahman Azam, had warned of, quote, war of annihilation, end quote, that would follow a decision for partition. Wikipedia says Abdul Rahman Hassan Azam lived from 1893 to 1976, also known as Azam Pasha, was an Egyptian diplomat and politician. Azam Pasha was the first Secretary General of the Arab League from the 22nd of March 1945 to September 1952. Azam also had a long career as an ambassador and parliamentarian. He was an Egyptian nationalist, one of the foremost proponents of pan-Arab idealism, and opposed the partition of Palestine. Back to the text. Quote, I personally wish that the Jews do not drive us to this war. as this will be a war of extermination and momentous massacre, which will be spoken of like the Tartar massacre or the Crusader Wars. ... This war will be distinguished by three serious matters. First, faith, as each fighter deems his death on behalf of Palestine as the shortest road to paradise. Second, the war, will be an opportunity for vast plunder. Third, it will be impossible to contain the zealous volunteers arriving from all corners of the world to avenge the martyrdom of the Palestine Arabs. Abd al-Rahman Azam, General Secretary of the Arab League. Judging from these later remarks by Azam, his martial words were intended, on the one hand, to impress the, quote, Arab street, end quote, and on the other, to forestall a military clash. Nevertheless, his threat of annihilation echoes the scenarios that the Nazis had foreseen in the summer 1942 after Rommel's military victories. At that time, the tone was set by the Wehrmacht and SS. 6 years later, others were making the decisions, but former Wehrmacht and SS officers were still involved. Already before the war, the Arab Higher Executive Committee had contemplated employing European mercenaries. Quote, potential recruits included German POWs who had escaped and found shelter in the Middle East, Polish veterans of General Anders' army who had refused to return to Communist Poland, Bosnians who had served in the Nazi Muslim Legion, Croat Ustash. There's a way to pronounce it. It looks like Ustasha, but it's Ustasha, I think they might have to say it. Ustasha. Serb, Chetniks, who had fled from Yugoslavia to Italy, and British defectors from the army and the Palestine police. In November 1947, the first mercenaries arrived in Syria. There's a couple of footnotes here. First footnote, David Tall, War in Palestine, 1948, Strategy and Diplomacy. I'm not seeing this book, but I am seeing... It might have it just be the same book under a different name, but let's see. It's titled War in Palestine, 1948, Israeli and Arab Strategy and Diplomacy. And the description says, Arab involvement in the Jewish-Palestine conflict had started during the late 1930s, but it was only in the wake of the UN partition resolution of the 29th of November 1947 that active military intervention was considered. The Arab League tried to form a unified army that would prevent the implementation of the partition resolution, but failed. In Egypt, the government and the army opposed the idea of dispatching an expeditionary force to Palestine, but the pressure of public opinion and King Farouk's insistence carried the day. The order was given, and in May 1948, Egyptian forces crossed the international border with Palestine. The author analyzes the reasons for the decisive victory enjoyed by Israel over a larger opponent and the successes and failures that were sealed in the Egyptian-Israeli General Armistice Agreement, signed in Rhodes in March 1948. End footnote. Back to the text. And the other thing that was cited was that last quote that I read is from Yoav Gelber, Palestine, 1948, War, Escape, and the Emergence of the Palestinian Refugee Problem. The description for this book says, since the 1970s, that's not a good description. The description says, since the 1970s, the Latin based on new or newly interpreted Israeli, British, and Arab documents, this book attempts to integrate present controversies concerning the development of the Jewish-Palestinian War from December 1947 to mid-May 1948 and the consecutive Israeli-Arab War. It follows the organization of both sides at the beginning of the war and the shaping of their respective war policies. Further, it describes the creation of the invading coalition and its disintegration in the wake of the Arab army's military failure. This book stresses mainly the process that led Palestinian society to its collapse and mass flight, and the Israeli reactions and policies that turned this temporary escape into a long-lasting refugee problem. Emphasizing the different historical and cultural perspectives of the adversaries in the context of the war's development, it criticizes the approach of the Israeli, quote, new historians, unquote, who tend to isolate the refugee problem from the broader issues of the war and treat it separately. Includes a glossary of Arab-Israeli wartime operations. Okay. End footnote, back to the text. Thus, Bosnian mercenaries joined up with Hassan Salameh, who had parachuted into the Jordan Valley in October 1944 as a major in the Wehrmacht and was now one of the leaders of a guerrilla force set up by the Mufti known as the Jihad Army. Wikipedia says no, this isn't the right guy. This is a different guy. Hassan Salama, also spelled Hassan Salameh, lived from 1913 to 1948 and was a Palestinian Arab nationalist, guerrilla leader, and commander who led the Palestinian Holy War Army in the 1948 Palestine War, along with Abdul Qadir al-Husseini. And the Wikipedia says for the Wikipedia for the Army of the Holy War, or the Holy War Army, was a Palestinian Arab irregular force in the 1947-48 Civil War in Mandatory Palestine, led by Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini and Hassan Salama. The Army of the Holy War has been described as Husseini's, quote, personal, unquote, army. The Arab League set up the Arab Salvation Army as a counter to the Army of the Holy War. While in practice, the Arab governments prevented thousands of volunteers from joining either force. Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini arrived in the Jerusalem sector in December 1947, and by March 1948 had about 128 men. Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini established Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini's headquarters at Bir Sait and started to conduct a blockade of Jerusalem by attacking the Jewish convoys to the city. Hassan Salama, with 950 men of the Jihad and 228 irregulars, took responsibility for the operations in Lida and Ramla sectors at the entry of the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem road. The Army of the Holy War had over 50,000 Palestinian Arabs available for local defense, but a force of only 5,000 to 10,000, both foreign fighters, from Arab states and Palestinian Arab militiamen available to be sent where needed during the 1947 to 1949 Palestine War. Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini was killed during the battle for control of Coastal Hill on the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem road on the 8th of April 1948. Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini's forces captured Kastal from the Haganah, which had occupied the village at the start of Operation Nachshon 6 days earlier with a force of about 100 men. They retreated to the Jewish settlement of Matzah. Palmach troops recaptured the village on the night of 8th to 9th of April. Most of the houses were blown up and the hill became a command post. Husseini's death was a factor in the loss of morale among his forces. When the All-Palestine Protectorate was formed on the 22nd of September 1948, during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, it viewed the Holy War Army with the declared aim of, quote, it revived the Holy War Army with the declared aim of, quote, liberating Palestine, end quote. However, the government had no money of its own and operated only under the supervision of Egypt and was generally ineffective. Bracket, citation needed, in bracket, so take that with a grain of salt. In October 1948, Jordan gave an order to its forces, the Arab Legion, to surround and forcibly disarm various units of the Holy War Army. So back to the text. At Hassan Salameh's side were German Wehrmacht officers. Wikipedia says, it says in the footnote, Salameh's son, Ali Hassan Salameh, was one of the organizers of the massacre at the 1972 Munich Olympics. Wikipedia says Ali Hassan Salameh lived from 1941 to 1979 and was a Palestinian militant. He was the chief of operations for Black September and founder of Force 17. Ali Hassan Salameh was assassinated in January 1979 as part of an assassination campaign by Mossad. Back to the text and footnote. The better-known commander of the Jihad army, Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini, in charge of Jerusalem, had been a Nazi collaborator and had taken part in the defense of the pro-Nazi regime in Baghdad. Wikipedia says Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, who lived from 1907 to 1948, was a Palestinian revolutionary and Arab nationalist guerrilla military leader. In late 1930, he founded the secret militant group known as the Organization for Holy Struggle, which he and Hassan Salameh commanded as the Army of the Holy War during the 1936 to 1939 Arab Revolt and the 1948 war. Back to the text. At Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini's headquarters in Birzeit, he hosted 36 Germans and 10 Britons. His closest associate, Fawzi al-Khatib, had undertaken a training course in bomb making in Nazi Germany. Footnote. See Monty Noam Penkower, Palestine to Israel, Mandate to State, 1945 to 1948. Volume 2, Into the National Arena. The description for this book says, 70 years after the creation of the State of Israel, Palestine to Israel, Mandate to State, 1945 to 1948, offers the definitive narrative of the achievement of Jewish sovereignty in the beleaguered Promised Land. Professor Monty Noam Penkower explores developments in Palestine and in the Arab states, including how the Palestine quagmire became a pawn in inter-Arab feuds, British and American responses, both official and public, the role of Holocaust survivors, the context of the Cold War, and the saga as it unfolded in the corridors of the United Nations. Joining extensive archival research to a lucid prose, the two volumes offer a riveting conclusion to his Palestine in Turmoil and Decision on Palestine Deferred. Second. And footnote. The second guerrilla group, the Arab Liberation Army, established by the Arab League, was also led by a former Wehrmacht officer, Fawzi al-Kawuki, maybe? Fawzi al-Kawuki. That's what it would actually look like. Wikipedia says Fawzi al-Kawuki lived from 1890 to 1977 and was a Lebanese-born Arab nationalist military fighter in the interwar period. He served briefly in Palestine in 1936, fighting the British mandatory suppression of the Palestinian revolt. A political decision by the British enabled him to flee the country in 1937. Fawzi al-Kawuki was a colonel in the Nazi Wehrmacht during World War II and served as the Arab Liberation Army field commander during the 1948 Palestine War. It's a pretty gnarly symbol. What it has is a circle with a Star of David in the middle with a dagger going through it. And the description for the Arab Liberation Army says, the Arab Liberation Army, better translated as Arab Rescue Army or Arab Salvation Army, was an army of volunteers from Arab countries led by Fawzi al-Kawuki. It fought on the Arab side in the 1948 Palestine War. The Arab Liberation Army, or the Arab Rescue Army, was set up by the Arab League as a counter to the Arab High Committee's Holy War Army, but in fact the League and Arab governments prevented thousands from joining either force. At the meeting in Damascus on the 5th of February 1948 to organize Palestinian field commands, northern Palestine was allocated to Kawuki's forces, although the West Bank was de facto already under the control of Transjordan. The target figure for the recruitment was 10,000, but by mid-March 1948, the number of volunteers having joined the army had reached around 6,000 and did not increase much beyond that figure. The actual number deployed might have been as low as 3,500, according to General Safwat. Its ranks included mainly Syrians, Lebanese, Palestinians, and a few hundreds of Iraqis, Jordanians, Muslim Brotherhood from Egypt, Circassians, and Bosniaks. There were also a few German, Turkish, and British deserters. Back to the text. According to Spiegel, the newspaper, in 1948, quote, important posts in Falsi's headquarters are occupied by members of the former German Wehrmacht, who otherwise form a large volunteer contingent of the Arab Invasion Army for Palestine. They are mainly former soldiers in Rommel's Afrika Korps, end quote. And, quote, escaped prisoners from Egyptian POW camps, end quote. No one appeared troubled by the fact that, quote, the German volunteers have adopted, quote, Die Fahne hoch, end quote, as their theme song from the old days, end quote. Footnote. Also known as the Horst Wessel-Lied. Which is, what's that? That's the Nazi theme song, right? Wikipedia says the Horst Wessel-Lied, also known as by its incipit Die Fahne hoch, the flag raised high, is the anthem of the Nazi Party, NSDAP from 1930 to 1945. From 1933 to 1945, the Nazis made it the co-national anthem of Germany, along with the first stanza of the Deutschlandlied. The Horst Wessel-Lied has been banned in Germany and Austria since the end of World War II, unless for artistic or educational purposes. In addition, many members of the Muslim SS divisions also took part in the war against Israel. It previously killed civilians in Bosnia and hunted Jews in Croatia. At the end of World War II, facing persecution if they returned to Tito's Yugoslavia, they had remained as stateless exiles in Italy, from where some hundred had moved to Beirut in 1947 and 1948. Quote, by the end of April, almost 1,000 Bosnian, Croatian, and Albanian volunteers had been in Palestine as members of 3 different units, end quote, along with, quote, 53 Germans and Britons, end quote, who also fought in the Arab ranks. Footnote. See the article by Seth J. Fransman and Jovan Kulibrk. Kulibrk? Or Kulibrk? I don't know, it's a weird spelling. Culibrk. Their article, Strange Bedfellows, the Bosnian and Yugoslav Volunteers in the 1948 War in Israel-Palestine. Militarily, these former Wehrmacht and SS soldiers played a secondary role. Politically, however, they were significant in that they embodied the continuity of the anti-Jewish war of extermination that had begun under Hitler. Aufbau A Jewish weekly published in New York at that time denounced the, quote, absolute belief of these murderers in uniform that they did not even lose the war. The world is allowing them indeed to complete Hitler's fanatical campaign to destroy the Jewish people, end quote. This first Middle Eastern war claimed the lives of 6,000 Jews, 1% of the Jewish population of Palestine at that time, and probably an even higher number of Arabs before the signing of the first armistice agreements at the beginning of 1949. Footnote: on the stages in this war, see Morris, 1948. Tal's book War and Gelber, Palestine. There is no record of the Palestinian Arab fatalities. Egyptian losses amount to some 1,400 dead. The Jordanian, Iraqi, and Syrian armies each suffered several hundred dead. And footnote. This fateful Arab invasion shaped the Middle East conflict as we know it today. It resulted in the flight and expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Arabs from Palestine. It ended in the destruction not of the Jewish state as originally predicted, but of the prospect of an Arab-Palestinian state, a prospect which remained extinct for decades to come. New section: Qualms of the Arab League. In most textbooks on the history of the Middle East, the onslaught of the Arab armies on the newly founded Israel is viewed as an inevitability. In the view of Israeli historian Benny Morris, quote, the war of 1948 was the almost inevitable result of ... Arab-Jewish friction and conflict that began with ... the first Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe in the early 1880s, end quote. Benny Morris. Admittedly, the Arab world was, at least in public, unanimous in its rejection of the UN partition plan. According to the Middle East Journal, early in 1948, quote, even those Arabs who sincerely hoped for an eventual understanding with the Jews of Palestine could see no reasonable basis for acquiescence in the partition scheme, end quote. After World War I, many Arabs considered that they had been betrayed by the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, in which Britain and France had delimited their respective spheres of influence, disregarding the prospect of independence that London had been holding out to Arabs. Wikipedia says the Sykes-Picot Agreement, or Picot Agreement, was a 1916 secret treaty between the United Kingdom and France, with assent from Russia and Italy, to define their mutually agreed spheres of influence and control in an eventual partition of the Ottoman Empire. The agreement was based on the premise that the Triple Entente would achieve success in defeating the Ottoman Empire during World War I, and formed part of a series of secret agreements contemplating the Ottoman Empire's partition. The primary negotiations leading to the agreement took place between the 23rd of November 1915 and the 3rd of January 1916, on which date the British and French diplomats Mark Sykes and Francois-Georges Picot initialed an agreed memorandum. The agreement was ratified by their respective governments on the 9th and 16th of May 1916. The agreement effectively divided the Ottoman provinces outside the Arabian Peninsula into areas of British and French control and influence. The British and French-controlled countries are divided by the Sykes-Picot line. Agreement allocated to the UK control of what is today southern Israel and Palestine, Jordan, and southern Iraq, and an additional small area that included the ports of Haifa and Acre, or Accra, I don't know how to say it, to allow access to the Mediterranean. France was to control southeastern Turkey, the Kurdistan region, Syria, and Lebanon. As a result of the concluded Sazonov-Parlag agreement, Russia was to get western Armenia, in addition to Constantinople and the Turkish Straits already promised under the 1915 Constantinople Agreement. Italy assented to the agreement in 1917 via the Agreement of Saint-Jean de Maurienne and received southern Anatolia. The Palestine region, with a smaller area than the later mandatory Palestine, was to fall under a, quote, international administration, end quote. The agreement was initially used directly as the basis of the 1918 Anglo-French modus vivendi, which provided a framework for the occupied enemy territory administration in the Levant. More broadly, it was to lead indirectly to the subsequent partitioning of the Ottoman Empire following Ottoman defeat in 1918. Shortly after the war, the French ceded Palestine and Mosul to the British. Mandates in the Levant and Mesopotamia were assigned at the April 1920 San Remo Conference. Following the Sykes-Picot framework, the British mandate for Palestine ran until 1948. The British mandate for Mesopotamia was to be replaced by a similar treaty with mandatory Iraq, and the French mandate for Syria and Lebanon lasted until 1946. The Anatolian parts of the agreement were assigned by the August 1920 Treaty of Sèvres. However, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Sevres. However, these ambitions were thwarted by the 1919-23 Turkish War of Independence and the subsequent Treaty of Lausanne. The agreement is seen by many as a turning point in Western Arab relations. Arabs saw it as the failure to keep a British promise in the McMahon-Hussein correspondence with Hussein bin Ali, King of Hejaz, regarding a national Arab homeland in exchange for supporting the British against the Ottoman Empire. The British later claimed that Palestine was meant to be excluded from the area of Arab rule, as it is technically located west of Damascus. For obvious reasons, the Zionists took the same position. The Arabs interpreted the letter as it reads, Lebanon, not Palestine, is to the west of Damascus and other areas mentioned. The agreement, along with others, was made public by the Bolsheviks in Moscow on the 23rd of November 1917 and repeated in the Manchester Guardian on the 26th of November 1917, such that, quote, the British were embarrassed, the Arabs dismayed, and the Turks delighted, end quote. The agreement's legacy has led to much resentment in the region among Arabs in particular, but also among Kurds who are denied an independent state. Back to the text. So that's the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. Following World War II, according to the Middle East Journal, quote, Palestine had become the test of the Arabs' independence. To surrender would mean a repetition of the defeat which had come upon them after World War I, end quote. The Arab camp, however, was divided, quote, over the extent of the means to be invested in the effort to prevent the establishment of the Jewish state, end quote. Tal, in the book abbreviated War. An especially controversial question was whether regular Arab armies should be used to thwart a two-state solution. Indeed, in the event, the Arab states, and notably Egypt, delayed deploying their armies until the last minute. In March 1948, they declared themselves ready to set up training camps for guerrilla fighters and provide them with arms for a civil war in Palestine. At the same time, however, quote, the Arab League, in decisions made at conferences in Inhas and Ludan in 1946 and delay in Cairo in 1947, stated that Arab armies would not invade Palestine, ... Instead, they would supply the Palestinians with arms, money, and volunteers, end quote. Footnote. See Philip Matar, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini and the Palestinian National Movement, published in 1988. And the description of this book says, Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, the principal leader of Palestinian nationalism during the British Mandate, was one of the modern Arab world's most controversial figures. He played a role in the 1992 Wailing Wall disturbance, took part in the Iraqi revolt of 1941, and was target of British and Zionist assassins during World War II. Philip Mattar now offers the first full-length biography of this intriguing figure, weaving a fresh and objective revisionist account. Mattar clarifies al-Husseini's role in the politics of Palestine. In the Mandate era and the Palestinian national movement. Mattar describes Husseini's rise to religious power as Mufti of Jerusalem and head of the Supreme Muslim Council. Mattar also demarcates two major phases in al-Husseini's career. During his first between 1917 and 1936, he was a cautious and pragmatic leader who, while opposing Zionism, cooperated with the British mandatory officials. The second phase, after 1936, was marked by militancy, frustration, and ultimately failure. Back to the text and footnote. 3 months prior to the Arab Army's invasion, the League's General Secretary, Abd al-Rahman Azam, had stated that the League's member states, quote, viewed the struggles in Palestine as a civil war in which they would only intervene with regular forces if foreign armies attacked the country and attempted to push through the partition by force, end quote. Abd al-Rahman Azam was backed up by General Mohammed Haidar, Egypt's defense minister. Quote, we shall never even contemplate entering an official war, end quote. He declared at the beginning of May 1948, quote, we are not mad. We shall allow our men and officers to volunteer for service in Palestine, and we shall give them weapons, but no more. End quote. General Mohammed Haidar, Egypt's defense minister. Wikipedia says Mohammed Haidar, born 1959, that's not who I'm looking for here. Wikipedia says Mohammed Haidar Pasha lived from 1887 to 1957, was an Egyptian military officer and politician. Haidar Pasha served in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War and played a leading role in the Egyptian politics before the 1952 revolution, especially in King Farouk's reign. Mohammed Haidar Pasha was appointed Minister for War by King Farouk. Haidar Pasha was also the 4th president of Zamalek SC. He is the longest serving president in the history of the club. Back to the text. Footnote. That quote from Haidar is from a book, is a citation from a book titled in John and David Kimcha, by John and David Kimcha, Both Sides of the Hill, Britain and the Palestine War. I don't really see any good descriptions of this book. Okay, moving on, in footnote. It was only at the very last minute, on the 12th of May 1948, that Egyptian Parliament agreed to send regular Egyptian troops to Palestine. Footnote. See Barry Rubin, The Great Powers in the Middle East, The Road to the Cold War. And footnote. I've already looked that book up, so I'm not going to do it again. It was only on at the where am I? Even then, on the 14th of May, the very eve of the invasion, Azam made, quote, no secret of his fears, end quote. caused by the, quote, strength of the opponent, end quote, and, quote, their support in the UN and from the great powers in East and West, end quote. Footnote. See the article by Trivia Kasimia titled Palästina in der Politik der Arabischen Staaten 1918 to 1948 in Helmut Macher's edited volume Die Palästina-Flagge 1917 to 1948, Historische Ursprünge und internationale Dimension eines Nationen conflicts. It doesn't look like there's any good descriptions for that though. So back to the text. End footnote. What lay behind the Arab leaders' months of reluctance, so starkly at odds with their grandiose proclamations of a, quote, war of annihilation, end quote. In 1948, there was at least 5 good reasons for these leaders to recoil from a full-scale war in Palestine. Quote, firstly, it would be an affront to the United Nations. The partition resolution of November 1947 had been prepared with unusual care. In April 1947, several weeks of debates on the Palestine question began in the General Assembly. On the 15th of May, the UN decided to establish an 11-member Special Committee on Palestine to investigate and report on the situation in the territory. The membership of this committee was drawn not from the Security Council veto-wielding powers, but middle-ranking and neutral countries: Australia, Guatemala, India, Iran, Yugoslavia, Canada, the Netherlands, Peru, Sweden, Czechoslovakia, and Uruguay. On the 1st of September 1947, the committee issued its eagerly awaited report. 8 countries supported the partition of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, whilst 3, India, Yugoslavia, and Iran, voted for a single federated state. In the light of these preparations, on the 29th of November 1947, over 2/3 of the UN member states voted in favor of partition. Starting a war in the face of such a clear decision was reckless, especially given that since 1945, Egypt, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Lebanon had been UN members. According to Dean Rusk, then director of the State Department's Office of United Nations Affairs, quote, armed interference in Palestine by the Arab states to prevent the implementation of the Assembly's revolution would clearly be aggression contrary to the obligations of those states under the bracket UN and bracket Charter, end quote. And the newly formed UN Ad Hoc Commission on the Palestine question stated in its report to the Security Council that, quote, it would be a dangerous and tragic precedent if a decision of the UN General Assembly should be thwarted by force, end quote. This report also suggested that the partition decision should be implemented by force, end quote. Footnote. See memoranda by Mr. Dean Rusk on the 26th of January 1948, cited after Herf, Israel, I think it's Israel's Moment is the book, and footnote. Footnote. See UN Bulletin Report to the Security Council, 16th of February 1948. End footnote. Second, it was a slap in the face of the superpowers, the USA and USSR. Both had backed partition, and both were opposed to the Arab war against partition. No one believed that, quote, that the Arabs would be so foolhardy as to challenge the combined authority of the United Nations, the United States, and the Soviet Union, quote, wrote Israeli diplomat David Küntzel. Wikipedia says David Küntzel lived from 1928 to 2010. David Küntzel was an Israeli diplomat, deputy director of the Mossad, spy master, and journalist. David Küntzel is believed to have been the main contact between the United States and Iran during the Iran-Contra affair. David Küntzel was president of the Israel Council on Foreign Relations and a member of the steering committee of the International Alliance for Arab-Israeli Peace. Back to the text. On the 25th of February 1948, Warren Austin, the U.S. representative at the United Nations, presented the Security Council with a draft resolution stating that the Council, quote, has to implement the partition decision, end quote, and that, quote, any attempt to change the decision of the General Assembly by force may be viewed as an act of aggression, end quote. The Security Council had the task of, quote, maintaining international peace and implementing the partition decision, end quote. I'm not looking up some of these people because they're like just kind of like tangential to this, not tangential, but like kind of like people in the UN, because they have whole other lives that have nothing to do with the UN, and it would, in like their biography, the intros to their biographies on the internet are fucking huge. So I'm not gonna read that. Footnote: a month later, Warren Austin temporarily backed away from supporting the partition plan. For more on the turbulent debates between U.S. President Harry S. Truman and the opponents of the plan in the Pentagon and State Department, see Jeffrey Herf, Israel's Moment. End footnote. Moscow, too, was outraged by the invasion, quote, it is now an obvious and undeniable fact, end quote, said Soviet UN representative Yakov Malik. Let me repeat that. Moscow, too, was outraged by the invasion. Quote, it is now an obvious and undeniable fact, end quote, the Soviet UN representative Yakov Malik stated in August 1948. Wikipedia says Yakov Alexandrovich Malik lived from 1906 to 1980 and was a Soviet diplomat. Yakov Malik, back to the text, Yakov Malik argued in August 1948, quote, that, the development of the new problem of Arab refugees in the Near East results from the sabotage of the General Assembly resolution on Palestine. Those who have contributed to that sabotage are directly responsible for the sufferings of these people. End quote. Footnote. See Yakov Ruai, From Encroachment to Involvement, a documentary study of Soviet policy in the Middle East. The description of this book, which is from 1974, says, during the past 3 decades, the USSR has attempted various kinds of political, military, economic, and cultural infiltration into the Middle East. Since the mid-50s, it has succeeded in establishing a continuous Soviet presence there. The book by Roy, I don't know how to say it. It's like R-O apostrophe I. Portrays and delineates Soviet Middle Eastern policies and methods of their implementation from 1945 to 1973. The author's primary aim is to classify and survey as comprehensively as possible the Soviet stand on the main events and developments in Middle Eastern history during the past 3 decades. This annotated survey of Soviet theory and practice in the Middle East presents the reader with a rich variety of original documents, mainly Soviet. They are carefully explained so that their context, background, and significance are highlighted. Supplementary notes, references, and bibliographies are also provided. And footnote. Or back to the text. In November 1948, the Soviet representative to the United Nations, Semyon Zarubkin, noted in the same vein, quote, the presence of Arab forces in Palestine was a direct violation of the appeal which the Assembly had issued, ... calling upon all states and individuals to refrain from any acts likely to ... hinder the implementation of the recommendations of the General Assembly, end quote. Semyon Zarubkin. Or Zarabkin. That's what I said. Or Semyon Zarabkin, I'm not sure. Semjon. What's the last one? Zarapkin. And Wikipedia says Semyon Zarabkin, who lived from 1986 to 1984, was a Soviet diplomat. Semyon Zarabkin was involved in negotiations over the 1963 Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, worked in the United Nations, and held various other diplomatic posts. Back to the text. Semyon Zarabkin went on to praise, quote, ... the quick action of the Jewish people in defending the area assigned to them, ... end quote. Semyon Zarabkin, and criticized the statement by the Egyptian UN representative who had claimed that his country's armed forces were a stabilizing force in Palestine. Quote, it would have been more true if he had said that it would have been more true if he had said that those who had directed the invasion of Palestine had done so in order to wreck the November resolutions, and their action had only served to increase the enmity between Jews and Arabs, end quote. Semyon Zarabkin. Today, the Soviet support for Israel seems surreal. This is due first to the still dominant narrative of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which has, for 50 years, defined the UN partition plan rather than Arab invasion as the real crime, and second to the reversal in the attitude of the Soviet Union, which by 1967 had begun to equate Zionism with Nazism. Back in 1948, however, Moscow even wanted the partition decision to be imposed by an international force, an idea rejected by the USA, which wanted to prevent Soviet troops from entering the Middle East. Third, many Arab leaders were not nearly as hostile to the partition plan as might appear from the outside. Thus, Emir Abdullah's real view, he was the king of Jordan, right? It's Abdullah. Yeah, Abdullah the First of Jordan. I'm starting to remember some things. The ruler of Transjordan, quote, hoped that every effort, thus Amir Abdullah's real view was that, quote, partition was the only solution, end quote. The ruler of Transjordan, quote, hoped that every effort would be made to ensure that it was adopted, end quote. Footnote, see Avi Shlaim's 1998 book, The Politics of Partition, King Abdullah the Zionist in Palestine, 1921 to 1951. The description of this book says, in this reissue, the abridged paperback edition of his critically acclaimed Collusion Across the Jordan, Professor Schlaim chronicles King Abdullah's relationship with the Zionist movement from King Abdullah's appointment as Emir of Transjordan in 1921 to his assassination in 1951, with a new introduction placing the book in the wider context of the ongoing debate about 1948. This masterly and authoritative study is essential reading for all those interested in the politics of the Middle East. Back to the text and footnote. In private discussions, the Egyptian Prime Minister Ismail Sidki also expressed a wish to accept the partition plan. According to Eliyahu Sassoon, Ismail Siddiqui, quote, repeatedly stressed that he is a businessman. He is neither pro-Jewish nor pro-Arab. He looks out for the welfare of Egypt. If that dictates Jewish-Arab understanding, so be it, end quote. Footnote, see the book by Michael Duran, Pan-Arabism Before Nasser. Eliyahu Sassoon lived from 1982 to 1978 and was a diplomat, member of the Knesset, and minister in the government of Israel. And then I wanted to look up that book, Michael Duran, Pan-Arabism Before Nasser, 1999. Sorry. The description for this book says, this book aims to alter profoundly the accepted version of the history of post-World War II Egyptian foreign policy. To this end, Duran convincingly demonstrates the absence of any true pan-Arab front from the very beginning of the Arab League. Considering Cairo's policy decisions during the critical years from 1944 to 1948, Michael Duran proves that Egyptian national interests were always placed before the United Arab Front against Israel. Even while participating in the 1948 war with Israel, Egypt regarded Zionism and the Palestine question as less important than achieving independence from Britain and thwarting the expansionist aims of Iraq and Jordan. Ultimately, this study is a bold rethinking of 20th century Middle Eastern politics and history, with key implications for both the study of the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict and the volatile politics of the Middle East in general. And footnote, back to the text. Mujahim al-Pachachi, Prime Minister of Iraq, echoed the sentiment, agreeing, according to a British source, that, quote, eventually there would have to be an acceptance of the Jewish state's existence, but for now it was politically impossible to acknowledge this publicly, end quote. Footnote, see Bruce Matty Weitzman, The Crystallization of the Arab State System, 1945 to 1954. The description of this book says, this volume contains a comprehensive examination of the crucial first 10 years of the Arab League and the continuing dilemma it faces in juggling opposing and local regional interests. Back to the text and footnote. And Wikipedia says Muzahim Amin al-Pachachi, who lived from 1891 to 1982, was an Iraqi politician who served as Prime Minister of Iraq during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Back to the text and footnote. Moreover, this was also the original position of Arab League Secretary General Abd al-Rahman Azam. According to a report by the Jewish Agency of August 1946, quote, there was only one solution in his view, and that was partition. But, as Secretary of the Arab League, he could not appear before the Arabs as the initiator of such a proposal, He would be prepared to support partition on (1 of) and (2) conditions. If one of the Arab states took into its hands the initiative and found the strength and courage to propose the thing in the League Council, or if the British requested him to work along these lines, he respected very much the Jewish achievements and strength in Palestine, and believed that if the Arab East came to an understanding with them, it would be able to reap great benefits, end quote. Footnote, see Neil Kaplan, Futile Diplomacy, Volume 2, Arab Zionist Negotiations and the End of the Mandate. Damn it. The description for this book says, with half of this book, first published in 1986, being given over to Neil Kaplan's detailed analysis and half of the collection of the original documents, the second volume in Futile Diplomacy provides another essential resource for the understanding of the Arab-Israeli conflict and Arab Zionist negotiations and the end of the Mandate. A key period in the negotiations between the two parties is examined as attempts were made by both sides to reach a peaceful negotiated settlement. Back to the text and footnote. Fourth, with the exception of the Arab Legion of Transjordan, the Arab armies were, quote, young, untrained, inexperienced, and poorly equipped with pre- or early Second World War types of armaments, None of the armies had any battle experience beyond repressing tribal insurrections, and all were by no means fit for combat, end quote. Gelber. Their main task up until that point was defending their respective regimes against domestic subversion. Since all the regimes, none of them elected, quote, suffered from a sense of illegitimacy and hence vulnerability, end quote. Morris, 1948. No wonder that the generals were even less eager to fight in Palestine than the political leaders who were amateur in military matters. Fifth, the Arab inhabitants of Palestine had not been consulted. Quote, most of the Palestinian Arabs have refused and still refuse to be drawn into the fighting, end quote, noted Ben-Gurion in February 1948. One reason for this was tens of thousands of them had found jobs and livelihoods in Jewish-controlled economic spheres such as Citrus-fruit farming that they did not wish to jeopardize. Another was that they were better informed about the military capabilities of the Zionists than the exiled Palestinians operating out of Cairo. And finally, the Mufti was far less popular among the Palestinian Arabs, whom they well remembered for his terrorism of the 1930s, than in other parts of the Arab world, and some indeed actively loathed him. A state run by Amin al-Husseini was the last thing they wanted to help bring about. In his study, Army of Shadows, Hillel Cohen provides examples of the determination with which Palestinian Arabs resisted their leaders' calls to arms, made non-aggression pacts with local Jews, and even supported the Jewish fighting forces. Here is a brief extract from Cohen's comprehensive survey. Quote, in December 1947, the inhabitants of Tulkarem refused to attack Jewish towns to their west, to the chagrin of the local Holy Jihad commander, Hassan Salameh. Resources in Ramallah reported at the same time that many were refusing to enlist, The villagers of the Bani Hassan Nahia, southwest of Jerusalem, decided not to carry out military actions within their territory, and the people of Al-Maliyah refused to request from Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini to attack the Jewish neighborhoods. This unwillingness to fight was frequently buttressed by agreement with Jews in nearby settlements. Sources in many parts of the country reported that local Arab representatives had approached their Jewish neighbors with requests to conclude non-aggression pacts. Arabs who made agreements with Jews and many others as well often refused to provide assistance to Arab military forces, and even tried to prevent them from operating in their vicinity. In several cases, Arab detachments could not find a village that would quarter them or allow them to deploy. Many Palestinian Arabs thus not only refrained from fighting themselves, but also did their best to prevent foreigners and locals from carrying out military actions. End quote. Hillel Cohen, Army of Shadows, Palestinian Collaboration with Zionism, 1917 to 1948. The description of this book says, inspired by stories he heard in the West Bank as a child, Hillel Cohen uncovers a hidden history in this extraordinary and beautifully written book, a history central to the narrative of the Israel-Palestine conflict, but for the most part willfully ignored until now. An Army of Shadows, initially published in Israel to high acclaim and intense controversy, he tells the story of Arabs who, from the very beginning of the Arab-Israeli encounter, sided with the Zionists and aided them politically, economically, and in security matters. Based on newly declassified documents and research in Zionist, Arab, and British sources, Army of Shadows follows Bedouins who hosted Jewish neighbors, weapons dealers, pro-Zionist propagandists, and informers and local leaders who cooperated with the Zionists, and others to reveal an alternate history of the Mandate period, with repercussions extending to this day. The book illuminates the Palestinian nationalist movement, which branded these, quote, collaborators, end quote, as traitors and persecuted them. The Zionist movement, which used them to undermine Palestinian society from within and betrayed them. and the collaborators themselves who held an alternate view of Palestinian nationalism. Army of Shadows offers a crucial new view of history from below and raises profound questions about the roots of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Back to the text and footnote. Okay. These Palestinian Arabs clearly saw advantages in allying with rather than fighting the Jews. Rather than a people united against injustice, the Palestinian Arabs were a deeply divided community that above all wished to be left in peace and greatly distrusted the Mufti. Oh, this is another quote from Hillel Cohen. The Palestinian Arabs clearly saw advantages in allying with rather than fighting the Jews. Rather than a people united against injustice, the Palestinian Arabs were a deeply divided community that above all wished to be left in peace and greatly distrusted the Mufti. Only a tiny minority of the 1.3 million Arab Palestinians enlisted in the war against Israel. Nimr al-Hawari, a contemporary Palestinian Arab activist, quote, estimated the number of conscripts as no more than a few hundred, to serve in a Palestinian army did not rank high in the population's ambitions. End quote. And that quote is actually from Ilan Pappé, an Ilan Pappé book, The Making of the Arab-Israeli Conflict, 1947 to 1951. Wikipedia says Muhammad Nimr al-Hawari was a Nazareth-born Palestinian who studied law in Jerusalem, graduating in 1939. Al-Hawari served in the British Mandate administration as chief interpreter in the District Court of Jaffa and chairman of the Association of Government Second Division Officers. Muhammad Nimr al-Hawari was transferred to Haifa, where he resigned his government position in 1942. On his resignation, he returned to practicing law in Jaffa. Al-Hawari started his career as a devoted follower of Amin al-Husseini, but broke with the influential Husseini family in the early 1940s. Muhammad Nimr al-Hawari, during the termination of the British Mandate, formed and commanded al-Najada, a paramilitary armed movement. Al-Hawari was in command of the militia in the defense of Jaffa until he fled in the mass exodus of Palestinians in late December 1947. Al-Hawari fled from Jaffa to Ramallah in December 1947. Al-Hawari, together with Ariz Shihada, also spelled Shehadeh, a lawyer from Ramallah, opened an office in the West Bank for refugee affairs. Muhammad Nimr al-Hawari returned to Palestine years later, became judge in the District Court of Nazareth. In 1955, Muhammad Nimr al-Hawari wrote and published a significant historic book, titled The Secret Behind the Nakba, as well as his native Arabic. Al-Hawari was fluent in English and Hebrew. Back to the text. We'll look at the Ilan Pappé book. The description of this book says... This seminal text by renowned Israeli historian Ilan Pappé discusses one of the most significant periods in the Arab-Israeli conflict, based on archival material that presents the reader with a comprehensive and general history of the origins and consequences of the 1948 war. While among Arabs and especially Palestinians, the events of that year are known as the Nakba, the catastrophe, the trauma, the disaster. For the Jews, and in particular for Israelis, their victory in the War of 1948 is a veritable miracle. For them, against tremendous odds and through heroic military effort, the Jewish community succeeded in thwarting attempts by the Arab states to destroy it. Pappé shows here that in sharp contrast to the recollections and myths of both sides, the military events of 1948 were not decisive. The victory of the Zionist organization and the fate of the Palestinians was determined by politicians on both sides. In the discussion and decisions of the United Nations in 1947-48, and in the Arab League long before a shot had been fired, Pappé argues that Israel's failure to take advantage of the genuine opportunity for peace with the Arabs at the UN-sponsored Lausanne Conference in 1949, resulting in the prolonged and tragic conflict between Israel and the Arab states, still very much alive today. Complete with a new foreword by the author, the book remains the authority on the subject for a new generation of readers. Back to the text and footnote. So, despite all the criticism of the partition plan, there was also much to be said from the Arab point of view against an invasion by regular Arab forces in May 1948, so why did it nonetheless take place? This brings us back to the topic of Islamic antisemitism. Okay, this is going to be the end of the third video of this chapter. Thank you so much for listening.